Do you think that there are better ways that people can collaborate and cooperate with each other to solve this? Maybe by, if we can't move everybody to the integral stage in time to solve some of these global issues, then can people maybe recognize that others have a perspective that's also valid and cooperate somehow?
Well, it comes to my mind actually the messaging and popularity of Greta Thunberg, and the fact that a 16-year-old girl can be at a certain developmental level that speaks to the rest of the world, and kind of launches that message forward. I don't exactly know what level she's at, but 16 years old wouldn't indicate extremely high, would it? But it's interesting that the level of messages that we're getting are from the types of people are at this seemingly lower level of development, and they're taking on.
Well, keep in mind that that what happens as you start to get into these higher, the word I've used is world-centric, meaning that they have some sort of understanding of a global situation and of all humanity. But there are actually, most developmental models, there are at least 3 or even 4 stages of world-centric that just keep getting more and more inclusive and more detailed. And it's one of the confusing aspects about development is that when you really sit down and start studying the stages that people go through, that you really do start to understand some very specific kinds of distinguishing features between these different stages of development and how they're going to see the world. And so one of the things that you find is that starting with, it's just a level of development that we call orange, but it's the level that was first emerged on a significant way during the Western Enlightenment, and it does have a rational orientation. So that's also during the Western Enlightenment, because of the rational empirical orientation, that almost all of the modern sciences were invented, because they're coming from this more rational stage of development. But then there are several more stages, and these really, they're not obvious at all until you actually look at the studies to say, okay, here's what it's looking like if you're at orange. And we have, in just the standard developmental model, most of them have around 6 to 8 major stages of development. And development, by the way, just sort of keeps continuing. There doesn't seem to be an upper stage. They just get rarer and rarer and rarer the higher and higher you go. So we'll see where that ends up. But most models, just starting with that orange, have at least 3 or 4 higher stages. So people hit that orange world-centric first global stage. In today's developed countries, they'll reach that in adolescence. They can reach the possibility of doing that. So somebody like Greta could easily reach a world-centric stage. And those world-centric stages, by the way, are the ones that are relatively rare worldwide. Again, only about 30% of the population has done that. But I think what Greta is doing is what that 30% at whatever stage they're at, they recognize a global issue. They recognize the problem, and they're frustrated by nothing being done, not only by their government, but in some ways by the 70% that just doesn't get the problem. And so when somebody like that comes along and makes a very emotional, very, very pitched notion, and people agree with that, then it's going to be very moving for them, and they're going to find it very, very. They're going to find her to be speaking very profound truths, and they might find it a little bit surprising because she is so relatively young. But it's not a surprise for most developmental models. What is so surprising in a certain sense is, given that any human being born in any sort of developed culture around the world today has access to at least these 8 major stages of growing up. What's so amazing about that is still how relatively slowly human beings get to some of those higher stages. Like most models will also make a break between what's called first tier and second tier development. And first tier development goes all the way through orange. It includes orange, it's world centric, and then it includes one above that. And the orange world centric was also the foundation of what we call modernity. And then in the 1960s, another stage started to emerge, and it's what we end up calling post modernity. And it's a stage we call green. Those are all still first tier stages, because a definition of a first tier stage is when you're at that stage, you think that your view of the world and only your view is correct, and everybody else is wrong. And so that just contributes to the sort of broad disagreements that human beings have with each other. But then there's this sort of monumental leap to what's called second tier. And Clare Graves, who is just a genius pioneer in developmental studies, he called it cataclysmic and, quote, a monumental leap of meaning. And what happens at second tier is, and most models have about 2 or so of those stages, is somebody at second tier will understand that all of the stages at first tier are necessary, but not complete in themselves. In other words, they understand that these are unfoldings of a single broad human development. And so you can't just look, orange can't just look at a lower stage and say, oh, that's entirely wrong. I disagree with it entirely. All of these stages are needed. And you have to go through all of them anyway if you're going to get to any of the higher stages. You can't skip stages. That's sort of the point. It's like you go from letters to words to sentences to paragraphs, and you can't go from letters to sentences and skip words. It just doesn't work. And that's the way developmental stages are. But what you find at second tier, and this is why a large number of developmentalists start using terms like integrated or integral for second tier, because they integrate all of the true but partial stages that came earlier. And so that's a really profound type of shift. But again, those are very, very rare. And the percent of the population, if about 30% reaches orange, world centric, the percentage that reach about the 8th stage on most models, that's only around 0.5%. So unfortunately, that's a little bit problematic. But I think the most problematic issue, and this just has to do with growing up. Remember, we still have waking up, and we have opening up, we have showing up, we have cleaning up. But one of the major problems with growing up is, certainly in Western cultures, for example, we don't have any trouble understanding that there's something like 12 grades of elementary school. People go from first grade, second grade, third grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. And then they graduate high school, and they may or may not go on to college. But it's not an embarrassing, it's not a put down or anything to say somebody's in the 8th grade. They're in the 8th grade, and they'll likely go on and be in the 9th and 10th, 11th, 12th grade. But once we get to the 12th grade, and about 18 years old, then all adults higher than that, they're all the same. They just stop that kind of growth and development. And so we don't have more grades of adult development. And in fact, that's exactly what all 100 of these developmental models have found, is that development continues into adulthood. And that's what makes it so absolutely fascinating. Because first of all, not only most college professors don't have a very good understanding of that, they certainly don't know the stages that are available. But people at large have almost no conception of this. And so one of the first things that has to happen before we can say what you were recommending about, well, can't people just understand that there are people at different stages of development? That's a very, very important item to understand. And as a matter of fact, I would think it's one of the most important things that humanity has to do, is to come to that kind of understanding. And so that's going to take this realization that development continues throughout your life. And that one of the things that you want to have available to you is the knowledge that wherever you are when you graduate high school or college or wherever it is, you can keep growing. There truly are higher stages of consciousness, stages of development that are available to you. And if you don't know about those, you're being cheated. You're actually being cheated out of your own higher humanity. And that's deeply unfair. And it's certainly unfair to the vast, vast majority of the world's population that are stuck at some of these lower stages. I mean, that's really just criminal in a broad sense. I mean, it's just horrifying. So one of the major things that we need to look at is, how can we just introduce this general notion that humanity continues its growth and development beyond its adolescence? Because right now people are sort of stuck at most in their adolescent mentality, and that's not good. So exactly how we'll do that, that's has yet to be determined. But it's certainly something that even if humanity at large doesn't know about, certainly any individuals who are looking to increase their own growth and awareness and consciousness need to know that there are a lot more ways that they can continue growing. And they can not only expand their consciousness through growing up, they can expand it through waking up and some of these other areas as well. And the problem, again, is that most models of reality include very few of those, even though the amount of evidence for each of those 5 areas that I've mentioned is absolutely overwhelming. It's just not deniable. And so that's what makes these kinds of realities so significant. And I'll give just a quick example. I'm sure you all know Jordan Peterson. Yeah. He was talking about this whole issue of waking up, of having this experience of enlightenment or awakening or metamorphosis or satori, where you go from feeling that you're just a sort of individual, what Alan Watts called a skin encapsulated ego. And that narrow identity just drops, and you feel that you're literally one with everything that's arising. You're one with the entire universe. The entire universe is arising within you, as a matter of fact. But that's a very, very common experience in most of the great paths of waking up around the world. For everything from Vedanta Hinduism to Zen Buddhism to Christian mysticism and so on. It tends to be an area that modernity and post-modernity have left out. It's just very rare that people know very much about that, let alone that they're actually practicing something that will help them have a waking up experience. So Jordan Peterson, whether you like him or not, he at least generally has some sort of evidence to back up what he's saying. And so he was talking about this waking up consciousness, and he was contrasting it with our ordinary, limited, narrow consciousness. So he's referring to these as sort of these 2 major types of consciousness that human beings have. And he said, more or less direct quote, the evidence for these states is overwhelming. The fact that they both exist is not deniable. And that was the specific phrase he used. It's not deniable. And that means the waking up experience, the evidence for that is overwhelming. It's not deniable. literally. But how many colleges will you go to and learn a practice of waking up? Not that many. So is that, I mean, all of the cultures that have introduced waking up, every single one of them have made a distinction between ultimate truth and relative truth. And relative truth is something that you can get from science, for example. If water has 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen atom, that's a relative truth. And these paths of awakening, paths of liberation, they don't deny relative truth. But they will say the only experience of ultimate truth is this waking up experience, this Satori experience. Because in that state, you're actually experiencing what's often called a ground of being, just an ultimate absolute ground of being. Everything is a manifestation of that ground of being. And when you have that kind of Satori experience or waking up experience, 95% of the people who have those experiences will say it's an experience of absolute reality. I have no doubt whatsoever. And that's what's so amazing about those experiences. And that, by the way, is the only practice or experience or consciousness that human beings have ever claimed gave ultimate truth. But there's no mistaking, and it's just not deniable that that's what they do and that those experiences are present. So we have these realities of, just from what we've looked at so far, of growing up and waking up. And the experiences of the existence of both of these is just not deniable. And so the question becomes, well, how many people are aware of just those two even? And the answer is not very many. How many world leaders know about either one of them? Not very many. How many thought leaders in any discipline know about them? Not that many. So we're ignoring ultimate truth, and we're ignoring the one way that adults can continue to grow and develop through growing up. So we're ignoring waking up, we're ignoring growing up. And by the way, we don't do much better with opening up and showing up and cleaning up. Those are also incredibly important realities. And they're just right over most people's heads, even though, again, the evidence is absolutely overwhelming for these things. And so that's it's one of the reasons that people who just even sort of stumble on to some sort of integral approach can get very excited about it, because it's showing them realities that are a very real part of them that they have full access to, but they had no idea was there. I mean, I remember when I first learned that there was this practice called Zen Buddhism, and that it was aiming for this thing called Satori. And I'd never heard of anything like that. And I was 17 years old. And this was back in the 60s. So meditation wasn't even really understood much at that time. And I read a 3-volume set of books called Essays in Zen Buddhism by a guy named D.T. Suzuki. And they kept talking about this Satori thing. And it became very clear to me that there was this consciousness, this awareness called Satori. And it really did show you something unbelievably important about yourself and about reality. I mean, it was actually a type of ultimate truth. And you had access to this. You could actually experience that for yourself. And for about 3 days, my response wasn't, oh, wow, I'm happy to find this out. I was infuriated. I was absolutely enraged. And I was enraged because I kept saying, why didn't anybody tell me this? Jesus Christ, I mean, I'm almost 20 years old and I don't know what ultimate truth is. How did this happen? And I was just absolutely enraged. And then I went out and found a Zen master and started practicing Zen. So it's not gotten much better, even though most people know what meditation is and so on. But if you look at classes for yoga now, it's always billed as, you know, it'll relax anxiety, it'll help with depression, it'll help with insomnia, it can even help lose weight, it'll help you at work. And that meditation was never invented to do any one of those things. Wherever it emerged, it all had the same goal. It was invented to discover God. And that's it. That's what meditation is for. That you don't even hear that much when you sign up for a yoga class. So we haven't gotten that much better. And certainly if you look at an overall integral framework, one of the things we want to do is really just open our minds to these kinds of truths that are out there. And by the way, the only kinds of truths that we include in an integral framework are indeed ones that we have a, quote, overwhelming amount of evidence for. These are not just my ideas. So these are very important. And then the whole framework itself, the whole idea is, okay, now you've got the point of how to look for all these other different kinds of truths. So keep going. I mean, don't stop. Go on and do something like metamodernism and so on. I mean, all of that is absolutely fine. And that's what the framework is meant to do. As soon as we see something else that's important being included, then we usually steal it, because that's what we try to do, is include everything that's real. But that's how it's supposed to be used. Mm-hmm. And what we found in a peer-reviewed journal on specifically this type of integral framework, we call it AQAL, AQAL, is that at last count, over 60 human disciplines had been reinterpreted according to this integral framework. So we had integral art, integral business, integral psychotherapy, integral conflict theory, integral history, and so on, through 60 other disciplines that realize that you can take all of these other elements, these are all real elements, and you can reinterpret the discipline you're in, including all those other elements, and it'll profoundly change what you're doing and the types of truth that you can acknowledge. And of course, the more truths that you can acknowledge, the better off you are, the better off we all are, basically.
Enter the Future Thinkers giveaway and win our brand new community membership, including in-depth courses, private calls, and more, as well as a supply of Qualia, a complete cognitive upgrade for your brain. To enter the contest, simply go to futurethinkers.org/giveaway and sign up for our mailing list to instantly get our 50-page guide on how to adapt to the future. There are many ways to increase your chances of winning. Enter the competition today. The brand new Future Thinkers members portal is now live. Develop your sovereignty and self-knowledge with our in-depth courses, get access to our weekly sense-making calls, join the Q&As with past podcast guests, and much more. Become a Future Thinkers member today at futurethinkers.org/members. To stay up to date with new episodes, subscribe to Future Thinkers on your favorite platform. And leave us a review or a like. It really helps out the show. And don't forget to share this episode on social media.